This is the second of two videos about why I think if the economy breaks down, then the state authority will break down. Last time, just to recap, what I talked about was why I think the economy is going to break down and why I can't see it not breaking down. What I was saying is I think that central banks, particularly the Fed, because the Federal Reserve in the States prints the reserve currency for the world, that the central banks are likely to move from printing and lending to printing and spending, i.e. just printing up money and spraying it out into the economy. If they do that, we get inflation, then all the debt that's percolated throughout every corner of the economy, that starts to blow up. So corporate debt, companies that are risky companies that have taken on debt, been lent to by banks, they will go broke. Then the banks that have lent to them, they have a lot of dud loans on their hands, they go broke. And mortgage lenders, property owners, people who borrowed money to buy shares, all of that becomes unaffordable. They all start going broke, and the only body that can bail them out is the state authority. And then if that happens, the state can't bail out everyone this time. The state is going to go broke, it will go bust. And I think that means that the state authority will then collapse. Now, I had a bunch of comments in the comments section of previous videos saying, well, the state might still be able to keep its grip, the people who run it might still be able to use that to get a better opportunity to grab power. And one intelligent comment was, well, the English state has remained standing for centuries. It's been centuries since the English state broke down. It can survive a little economic breakdown. Well, I'm not certain about that because, I mean, it's been centuries since we had an economic breakdown. Perhaps you might be able to go back to the English Civil War or the Peasants' Revolt, but a long time. I mean, the two seem to go hand in hand, even in English history. So I don't think you can rule out the authority of the state breaking down. It might seem unthinkable. That doesn't mean it can't happen. Now, what I want to look at is three things. Firstly, the unpopularity of, or the mistrust in the system and the personnel in the system, the politicians. The second thing I want to look at is the 2011 riots, which are the most recent hint of the break in the state authority. And the third thing is what people think democracy is for, why they would remain loyal to it, why they would cease to remain loyal to it. Now, looking at the first one, the unpopularity of politicians and democracy and capitalism. Well, let's look first at politicians. That's always fun. They are not unpopular, they are despised. I'd say it's fair to say they're detested. There's a poll from the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index, which I'd never heard of, but I've heard of Ipsos Mori. They do opinion polls, and apparently they're the longest running poll on trust in professions in Britain, and they found that the least trusted profession in the UK is politicians. I think they mean MPs and ministers. So if you are an MP, you are trusted by 17% of the population. That's 1 in 6. So if you're an MP and you walk down your high street and you're stopping people asking, do you trust me? You're probably going to have to stop 6 people to get one of them to say, yes, I trust you. Okay. And if you're an MP and you get promoted to minister, you get promoted in terms of public trust. The public's trust in you goes up by 2% to 19%. So if you're a minister and you walk down the high street and you stop people, do you trust me? You have to stop only 5 of them to get one of them to say, yes, I trust you. There is no trust in the personnel. I think that's serious because that's the misdeeds, the mistrust in politicians is something that was used by criminals in 2011 as an opportunistic excuse to go and loot Gucci. Okay, so I don't think that's something to be dismissed. There's more than just a bit of fun, although it is funny. I'll leave a link to that Ipsos Mori poll below. It gets more serious than that when you look at dissatisfaction with democracy and people's mistrust of democracy. So it's not just the personnel, the personalities, it is the system itself that people have lost trust in. There's an article, a BBC article entitled Dissatisfaction with Democracy at Record High, and that talks about a study conducted by the University of Cambridge's Centre for the Future of Democracy. in 2019, they've been doing studies. Record high means the highest. Mistrust of democracy is at the highest it's been since '95, when that Cambridge Centre started doing its surveys. Now, in '95, it found that 47% of the British public were dissatisfied with democracy, and over the next 10 years, we became more satisfied with democracy. So that figure, dissatisfaction, went down to 33%. In 2019, they found that 61%, just shy of 2/3 of the British public, were dissatisfied with democracy. And that was worse than it is throughout the world generally. So America and the UK lead the world in mistrust or lacking trust in democracy. Around the world, it was 58%, a little bit less. And that number is borne out by a completely different study done by what's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which again I'd never heard of, but the Edelman Trust Barometer in 2020, what they found was that 3 out of 5 people had lost faith in democracy, and more than, so that's the same as 61% basically, well, that's 60%. More than half of the British public believed that capitalism does more harm than good. I think that is perhaps more serious than mistrust in democracy, because that suggests that people are hostile to the economic system, that people might say to themselves, if the system breaks down, they might say, well, I don't like it, it's chaotic, but at least I'll be better off because it's getting rid of a harmful system. And it certainly means people are not going to stand up very, very staunchly to try and protect the system, to keep the system going. And that bad news that's confirmed by another study I found out about, which is about or done by the British Social Attitude Survey. I think that might have been going since before World War II. And what they found was that in 1983, 90% of the British public thought that banks were well run, and today that figure is 19%. So it's gone from 9 out of 10 thought banks are well run in '83. Today, 1 in 5 think that. Banks have been declining in trust, and that's like they're like representatives of the financial system, or really of the wider economic system, but certainly of the financial system. And if that trust is so low, I'd say that amounts to hostility. The hostility to banks has really kicked off after 2008 and has only got worse. Again, people are not happy about the economic system. They don't think it works for them. I think they will say, well, maybe there's a good side to economic breakdown. They won't stand up to stop it. Now, the second thing I want to look at is the riots of 2011, because that's a recent sign of cracks in trust or the authority of the state. That's 10 years ago. But it wasn't just rocketing crime. There was a sense that the state couldn't and shouldn't control us, certainly among criminals. And I think a lot of people are having ambivalent attitudes towards that. Some Labour politicians, they blamed it on the ending of the one welfare benefit called the Education Maintenance Allowance, which basically shelled out 10 to 30 quid, between 10 and 30 quid a week to teenagers to make sure they stayed in higher education. That had been ended, and so some Labour politicians were saying that's why people went out rioting. Okay, the rioters themselves, well, my only comment to that is, if you think the loss of 10 to 30 quid a week for some teenagers is enough to cause that rioting, what is going to happen if the welfare state closes its doors, if hospitals can't operate, if there's no housing benefit check landing on the mat, if you're not getting social security, if your local town hall and library and sports centre, if they all close down, how much more are people going to be forced into rioting if that happens? Now, what the rioters themselves, basically being a bunch of criminals, they blamed it on MP's expenses scandal. They also a little bit on the banking crisis, or the bank bailouts, and also on phone hacking, where the big newspapers hacked into people's phones. But there's there's probably some truth to that. Things go wrong, or trust is engendered at the top. And when it was found that MPs were filling their expenses, that gave criminals the opportunity to go off the leash. My view, for what it's worth, is the reason those riots happened is because we just don't lock up enough people for long enough. We're not chucking away the key enough. 3 out of 4 of those rioters, or the ones who got convicted or cautioned, had previous convictions. And of the ones who had previous convictions, they had an average of 15 previous convictions. 1 in 4 of the people who got convicted after those riots had more than 10 previous convictions. That was criminals taking the opportunity. But the reason it stopped was because the state hadn't broken down. The courts, there was still money to pay the courts, to pay the lawyers, the courts still functioned, and the court stamped down hard. So the custard-faced old pederast sitting on the bench, he stamped down on the crims from a great height, and good on him. It did a good job. It put a stop to those riots, and they went away for a good long time. Now, what appears to happen is criminals sense a wider dissatisfaction in the system. They see an excuse. They're probably not going to get condemned or stood up to so much, and that's an opportunity for them, and they go and loot Gucci and blame the bent politicians. Now, the necessary thing, stamping on criminals, that is not going. I don't think that can happen if the state goes broke, because how do you pay the law enforcers? Okay, supposing all the police will work for nothing, or supposing the police manage to pay themselves by keeping traffic fines, fining you at the side of the road, taking money off you, keeping it, putting it in their pocket, that's their pay. Supposing they manage to do that. What about judges and lawyers? How many lawyers do you think are going to work for nothing to keep the system going? I suspect we'll find that a lot of those lawyer jokes are pretty accurate. Now, even if all the police decide to stay on with inadequate pay, and what happens when you get economic breakdown is quite a lot of policemen find, some policemen find it's more profitable to become criminals than it is to stay as policemen, not getting paid. So, but even if all the police stay on duty, they can't prevent that kind of outbreak in crime. Rocketing crime is the main thing that happens when you get economic breakdown. It's the main sign. People who might have thought of burgling your house but didn't do it, they graduate up to becoming burglars. They say, well, I'm going to do it now. People who were burglars, they stop being burglars, they can't become home invaders. So they don't wait for you to go out, they wait for you to get home. Then they smash down your door, hit you over the head, and ask you to tell them where your money's hidden. And the number of police just isn't adequate to deal with that kind of level of crime. We've got about 200,000 people employed by the police force in the UK. About 125 of those are what you and I would call coppers, who can go out on the beat on the streets. That's 2 for every 1,000 people. Now, the number of criminals is too many for that. 1 in 3 British men have a criminal record, and about half of those have more than one previous conviction. Okay, so half of them have one, so that means 1 in 6 British males are criminals with more than one conviction, and 125,000 coppers on the street just isn't, or 2 for every 1,000 people. That is not enough to contain the level of criminality that you're likely to see if the state breaks down. Now, the third thing is a psychological thing. What are people's attitudes? What do people think the state is for? Because if people think the thing the state is for, the state has lost its purpose, they are not going to mind if it falls over. Now, that there's that Edelman Trust Barometer, they published one figure which said that the quote from them is that the NHS, crime and improving the standard of living are concerns shared by between 80 and 85% of the population. So those 3 things are the main concerns of the British public. I think what I take from that is that that's what the British public think the state authority is for. The NHS, okay, probably that means that the wider welfare state. That's one thing that we think the state authority is for. Well, if the state goes broke, the NHS goes broke. The NHS can't pay you, money that it doesn't have. I don't see how the welfare state can't pay money it doesn't have. I don't see how the NHS keeps going, no matter how idealistic all the doctors and nurses are. Okay, crime, what about crime? Well, again, if you get economic breakdown and even any sign of a crack in the authority of the state, as we saw in 2011, you get a lot of rocketing opportunistic crime. A lot of it very serious. I think 6 people died in 3 days of rioting in 2011. And people, I think, will say, well, the state's job is to protect us from crime. Crime is out of control. The state has failed. So that's another way in which the state has broken the deal with me. And the third thing, improving the standard of living. Well, what can you say? If the economy breaks down, it's pretty unlikely that your standard of living is going to improve. People are going to find their standard of living has broken down again. So the 3 things that people think the state, that I think people think the state is for, they're gone. People at that stage are likely to say, well, what's the purpose of the state? What's the purpose of democracy now? We didn't like it much beforehand. We're not going to stand up and protect it now. And in those circumstances, the link between the people and the state, I think, will go. The state would have broken its side of the bargain, and then what you have is not just anger, but rejection of the power and authority of the state. And that, in a democracy, under a democratic state, means the breakdown of the state authority. And that's why I think if the economy breaks down and the state goes broke, the authority of the state authority itself, will collapse.